Hello, my name is Keith. Welcome to this short tutorial on API flows in Infor Ion. API flows are a feature of Ion, and Ion is an integration hub that's part of Infor. Infor also includes an API gateway that proxies APIs into a single gateway with unified security, management tools, and transformation capabilities. And these API flows can orchestrate those already existing APIs that are in the API gateway into a single new API. So you can combine them together. And you'd want to do this because you're trying to achieve a simpler and easier code to maintain from your developers. So for example, if your application you're building has to connect to 3 APIs, then it's possible that your application will have to make 3 individual request response calls to the API gateway, as well as authenticate 3 different times. For the developer creating that application, that's complexity that might be able to be removed. In the case of an API flow, that same developer creating that application can make just one call to the API gateway, and the API flow orchestrates the rest of the calls to the various APIs and returning one result back to the application that you're building. So we'll take a look at how to build one of these API flows, and we'll use the following example. Let's say we have this business problem. We're going to build a mobile app and it needs customer data from Infor Cloud Suite Financials. But that same app also needs customer data that's stored in Amazon S3, and the data in Amazon S3 is based on the data that we first get from Cloud Suite Financials. And Infor and Amazon have different security mechanisms, which they do, different user setup, etc. So if we could avoid making multiple calls to get all this data, that would be good. So the solution is to use the CSF customer API that's already provisioned in the Infor Cloud Suite, and then register an Amazon S3 API in the gateway, and then orchestrate the CSF API call first that returns some data that will then pass in to another API call to return some data and return both results back to the originating application. Let's see how this is done. Okay, the first step in our process is to go into the API gateway and find the Cloud Suite Financials customer API that I need. I've browsed to available APIs to the Cloud Suite Financials suite, and now gone in and searched for company customer API, and I came up with the one that I wanted. I'm going to use the generic list service in this case. I've selected a few fields here that I want to return. The number of records to return, I just need 1. I put in my key values I want to search by, company 1 and customer 3. Set a couple other parameters to false. I can now hit execute and try out this API, and I see that it is returning the company, customer, and data that I want in JSON format that I want. Great. So as a developer, I've explored the API. I know it's returning what I want. I know how to work with the API. That's important. The next is that I need to add AWS S3's APIs into the API gateway. So I went ahead and did this. I clicked add and then added the definition for these APIs. Again, in the description for this video, you'll see links for information on where I got this information, including the Swagger documentation. But here is my setup for Amazon S3. S3 is Amazon's simple storage service. You're storing data or files in buckets, they call them. And this particular API, you specify the bucket and the folder, and it returns the data from the file that you specified. And you can also see that I've loaded in the Swagger or OpenAPI specification for this API so that I can test it out and also explore it just like I did with the Cloud Suite Financials API. And in this case, I'm going to use the get folder item method in my API flow. Now that I have both my APIs and I know how to use them, I can jump over to the Ion desk and build my API flow. And here I've navigated to connect API flows, and I've clicked on create a new flow in the modeler. I've given it a name and a short description, and then I've drug 2 API calls onto my flow. The first one is to my CSF customer API. And you can see I've specified the API here that I was just testing in the gateway. Based on that selection, it knows the input parameters. I've typed in several different fields, just like I did in the API gateway when I was testing the API, that I want to return, the records to return, the key fields to make the query. And here you can see that instead of just typing in the values, I'm going to use inputs, right? And I've specified these inputs in the start node. So I've said that there are two inputs to these two request parameters, company and customer. We'll forget about the rest of the setup for just a second. I just want you to realize that this company and customer fields are right there. And in my first API call, I am using those inputs as using variable substitution. How did I know that syntax, that $? I just pressed Control Spacebar and selected company, and then over here I did Control Spacebar again and selected customer. I set a couple other parameters of false, just like before. And then on my output parameters, I described all the fields that I want to retrieve from this API. So again, when I was playing in the API gateway, I tested different fields that I wanted. They're all now listed here. The path section of this is in JSON path format. If you don't know what JSON path is, don't worry. I'll also provide a sample website that helps you define or decide what this path syntax should be to get to the data you want in your JSON. And then finally, I've got a test tab, and I can type in my test fields just to make sure this is working. And sure enough, all my data is coming back for the customer that I want. The next thing I'll do is drag another API step on to make my call to AWS S3. So this is in series, right? The output of this first API call is going to become the input for the second API call. So based on one particular field, and in this one, I've also specified the API and the gateway to call here on the first tab. And then the input parameters are going to be one, a field that came back from my first call. And again, I can just reference that by pressing Control Space and selecting that field that came back from the first call. And then the other one is hard-coded. My actual folder is in a folder called Customer in AWS S3. Since this is a GET, I don't have any request body again. And my output parameters is going to be one value that I'm retrieving from S3 called code. And again, that's in a JSON path format. I can test this and say that based on my output from the first API, which was sys, that retrieves a code from Amazon S3 with this value. Okay, so now my API flow is complete, but I've decided to do one other kind of fancy step here, and that is to drop a decision step in between these. And that decision is going to make sure that I'm actually getting a value out of this first step. If I don't get a value out of this first step, I'm not going to go ahead and call the second one. I'm just going to skip that step and go to the end. And it could be you could be looking for a specific value or null value. It's all based on this expression that you put on here. In this case, I'm saying the value of customer found, which was the decision parameter right here, customer found equals this value of bank transaction code that came out of the first API call. If that is not equal to null, then say we found it. You could say if it's equal to a certain value or greater than a certain value, less than a certain value. It's whatever type of expression that you put in here. And so then I put in my expression value of found. That's the first branch. You can do multiple branches here as well. I'm just going to do one branch. It goes up and makes the second call. And the output value of this whole branch is going to be the output value of the API call. So again, make the call to Cloud Suite Financials, get the bank transaction code, make sure that we got a value with the decision branch, move on to the next API call, retrieve the value for the code from Amazon S3, and return it all back to the calling application. I said I skipped a little bit of setup in the start node at first. That's because I wanted to show you the general flow first. Back here on the start button, we had to fill in a little bit more information. First, what is the endpoint going to be called for this new API that I'm creating? Because as soon as I save this and hit the activate button, it's going to publish this as a new API into the gateway. And it needs an endpoint, a URL for that API. So I've called it mobile because I'm building a mobile application, and customer for the resource, and version 1 for the endpoint, and prod for production and the resource path. We'll see how that all adds up together to a URL in just a second. The request body, of course, is blank. Then I had to type in what the response back to the calling application was going to look like. So I took all the data I was getting back, including the customer code from Amazon S3 and all the rest of the fields that I was getting from Cloud Suite Financials, and I put it all together into one response. One call, one request, one response. That's the beauty of the API flow. And again, I can put my company and customer in here and test this whole flow out to make sure that it's working before I activate it and put it in the gateway. And here you can see I am getting valid data back. So I save my flow, I reactivated, or in this case reactivating because I'd saved it before. And now I can jump back into the API gateway, go look at my available APIs, search for flows. And you can see that I'll have a suite in the API gateway now called Infor API Flows. All the flows that I published will have their endpoints located here. And I called it V1 for version 1. So there's my new API that I just created with the flow. Here's my one method called getProd. I have my company and customer inputs for that API, so I can test them out here and hit execute. And sure enough, that API is working in the published and working in the gateway just like it was when I was testing in the modeler. So now I'm ready to write my code in my mobile application, call the API gateway, and call this particular endpoint to get this data back in one call instead of 2 that it would have previously taken me. For more information on everything that we talked about in this tutorial, please reference the Ion Desk user guide that's online. I'm also uploading the API flow that we built during this tutorial to our Ion user community. So you can download that and use it for reference. And please reference Amazon's API setup documentation for S3. Links to all 3 of these things are in the description for this video. Thanks for watching.